The West was a land where pride cut deeper than hunger, and reputation often mattered more than truth. In a small frontier town, a poor farmer walked with his head lowered, his clothes worn thin, and his hands rough from endless labor. To the townsfolk, he was nothing more than a symbol of failure, a man mocked for what he lacked, shamed openly for his poverty. Laughter followed him like a shadow, cruel and sharp, as if his worth could be measured only by the weight of his pockets. But beneath that dust-stained exterior lay something no one had yet seen, something that would soon silence every voice of scorn. The night fell heavy with whispers of hunger. Beyond the town's borders, a nearby tribe was breaking under the weight of famine, children crying for food, elders growing weaker by the hour. The townsfolk who had ridiculed the farmer turned away, consumed by their own survival, unwilling to share what little they had. Yet the man they mocked, the one they called worthless, carried a secret hope. His fields, though small, had yielded enough to fill more than his own table. And in that moment, he chose not bitterness, but compassion. At dawn, while the town still slept, the farmer loaded his wagon. It was not gold or cattle that he carried, but sacks of corn, potatoes, and bread he had saved with quiet care. He did not announce his intentions, nor seek recognition. He simply drove into the horizon where the starving tribe waited, their eyes hollow yet still burning with life. When he arrived, silence fell, not the silence of shame, but the silence of awe. For the man they had all dismissed, as poor had become their deliverer. The tribe ate that day, their hunger eased by the hands of a man who knew hunger himself. Children who had not smiled in weeks laughed again as they filled their bellies. Mothers wept in gratitude, and elders lifted trembling hands in blessing. The farmer stood quietly among them, his gaze humble, his heart steady. He did not need words, for his actions spoke louder than any defense he could have given to those who scorned him. And back in the town, when word spread of what had happened, shame turned its gaze upon the very people who had mocked him. For while they ridiculed, he acted. While they turned away, he gave. And in that moment, the farmer's poverty revealed itself as the richest strength of all, the ability to give when the world believed he had nothing left. It was a lesson the West would not soon forget, a reminder that true wealth is measured not in possessions, but in the power of compassion. The morning after his quiet act of generosity, the farmer returned to his small homestead. His wagon was empty, his back weary, yet his heart carried a peace he had not felt in years. He knew the town would never understand what he had done, nor did he expect gratitude. But somewhere beyond the horizon, children were alive, mothers could rest their eyes without fear, and elders could breathe without the ache of hunger. That was enough for him. Still, whispers soon began to travel faster than the dust on the wind, and by the time the sun rose high, the townsfolk had heard the truth they could not ignore. At first, disbelief spread among them. How could the man they mocked, the one they called too poor to matter, be the very reason an entire tribe had survived another day? Some scoffed, claiming it was a lie meant to win sympathy. Others grew uneasy, remembering the laughter they had thrown at him only hours before. Shame began to settle like a weight on their shoulders, pressing harder with every retelling of the story. And as the truth gained ground, the town's own poverty of spirit became clearer than ever. The farmer, however, did not defend himself. He did not correct their doubts, nor answer their questions. Instead, he went back to his fields, tending the soil with the same quiet diligence that had always marked his days. Each seed he planted became more than food. It became a symbol of his resolve. He worked with hands that had known ridicule, but his labor now carried the strength of a man who had proven that dignity could not be stolen, no matter how harsh the scorn. The tribe, grateful for his gift, sent a few of their people to visit him. They carried with them tokens of respect, beads crafted with care, hides tanned by skilled hands, and words of blessing that even he, though not fluent in their tongue, understood. They called him brother, guardian, a man of worth in a world quick to judge by appearance. To them, his fields were sacred ground, for they had given life when all else had withered. The bond formed that day between the tribe and the farmer was one no laughter could break. But the town could not look at him the same way again. Each time he walked through the square, silence followed him. Not the silence of mockery, but the silence of guilt. Men who once smirked turned their eyes away. Women who had whispered insults now lowered their heads. And though no apology was spoken, every glance confessed what they could not bring themselves to say, that they had been wrong, and the man they scorned had revealed their own emptiness. As days turned into weeks, the farmer's act became a story retold by travelers moving across the plains. Word of his generosity spread beyond the town's borders, carried by those who had witnessed the tribe's gratitude. Strangers arrived asking about him, curious to see the man who had given when he had so little. Some came with admiration, others with disbelief, but all left changed by the sight of a farmer who worked humbly, never boasting of the lives he had saved. His legend grew, not because of his words, but because of the undeniable truth of his actions. The townsfolk grew restless under the weight of their shame. They could not undo their cruelty, nor erase the laughter that had once echoed through their streets. Some tried to make amends by offering help in his fields, but the farmer accepted little. He was not a man of vengeance, but neither was he eager to seek validation from those who had mocked him. His life was not a performance for their approval. It was a steady rhythm, guided by the principles of the land and the quiet strength of endurance. The ranchers who had once looked down on him began to see him differently. They realized that wealth alone did not define a man's worth, nor did land or cattle ensure legacy. The farmer had taught them that true abundance was revealed in the moment one chose to give, even when holding little. His example unsettled their pride, for it challenged the very foundation of their arrogance. Many resisted the lesson, but deep within, they knew they had been measured and found lacking. Meanwhile, the tribe returned often, not out of need, but out of respect. They brought gifts of food from their hunts, shared their songs around his fire, and treated him as family. Their presence was a living reminder to the town that compassion could bridge divides that greed and pride could never mend. The bond between the farmer and the tribe stood as proof that generosity was stronger than prejudice, and that the West, harsh as it was, could still produce stories of grace. Yet beneath this fragile peace, tension stirred. Some townsfolk began to whisper that the farmer's growing reputation would overshadow their own. Envy, bitter and sharp, crept once more into their voices. They wondered aloud how long before he claimed influence, how long before the man they had once mocked stood taller than all of them combined. And so, just as quickly as respect had grown, resentment began to take root in the shadows, setting the stage for a new storm on the horizon. The storm did not come with thunder or lightning, but with whispers that slithered through the saloon and down the dirt roads of the town. Men with empty pride began to claim that the farmer's generosity was nothing more than a trick to gain favor with the tribe. Others muttered that he had hidden wealth, that no poor man could have given so much without some secret fortune tucked away. The lies grew like weeds, twisting truth into suspicion. For those who could not match his dignity, tearing it down became their only weapon. The farmer, however, did not answer slander with defense. He had long since learned that words were fragile against envy, and he let his silence speak. His fields bore witness to his truth, row after row of crops sprouting under his care. His wagon creaked each week with supplies for those in need, not only for the tribe, but even for widows in town who had once turned their backs on him. While others wasted breath on gossip, he built a legacy with his hands. And though the words cut, he never lowered himself to strike back. The tribe, hearing of the whispers, stood firmly at his side. Warriors rode into town not with threats, but with dignity, their presence a shield against malice. They brought with them stories of the farmer's kindness, testimonies of the lives he had saved, and gifts as symbols of their bond. Their loyalty silenced some, but for others, it only deepened resentment. Prideful men could not endure the sight of a once poor farmer standing taller than them, supported not by wealth, but by respect. Children, however, saw the truth more clearly than their elders. They would follow the farmer to his fields, laughing as they carried buckets of water, listening as he taught them how to read the soil and watch the skies. To them, he was no figure of shame, but a teacher, a man who showed that greatness was not about riches but about heart. The laughter of those children, light and unburdened, became the melody of his days. And while adults argued over his worth, the next generation already knew the answer. Still, the tension in town grew heavier with each passing day. The same men who had once mocked him now feared being forgotten in his shadow. Envy does not die easily in the West. It festers, it sharpens, it waits. And though the farmer walked in peace, he sensed the storm was not finished. The land itself seemed to whisper that every act of compassion carries a cost, and that his greatest trial had yet to come. It began one late afternoon when the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of fire. The farmer was returning from his fields when a group of townsmen confronted him at the edge of the square. Their eyes burned not with hunger, but with envy sharpened into hatred. They accused him of betrayal, of giving strength to the tribe while leaving his own people behind. Their words twisted like barbed wire, meant not to uncover truth, but to ignite anger. The crowd that gathered was restless, torn between shame and fear, waiting to see how the farmer would respond. He did not answer with rage. Instead, he stood steady, his hands rough but calm, his gaze unshaken. He reminded them, without raising his voice, that hunger had no boundaries, that compassion was not betrayal, and that a man's worth was measured by what he gave, not by what he withheld. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of his life, and for a moment, silence fell over the square. Some bowed their heads in shame, knowing he spoke truth, but others clenched their fists tighter, unable to let go of their pride. One of the ranchers, his fortune vast, but his spirit hollow, stepped forward with venom in his tone. He declared the farmer a danger, claiming his alliance with the tribe would bring ruin to the town. Fear rippled through the crowd, for fear is easier to believe than truth. Murmurs rose like sparks in dry grass, ready to burst into flame. The rancher's voice was loud, but behind it was the desperation of a man terrified of losing his place to one he once ridiculed. The tribe's warriors, who had accompanied the farmer, placed their hands on their weapons, ready to defend the man who had defended them. The air grew thick with tension, every heartbeat a drumbeat toward violence. Mothers pulled children back, old men whispered prayers, and the square seemed to hold its breath. The farmer, however, lifted a hand to still his allies. His silence, once mocked, now carried authority enough to calm even those prepared to fight. That moment became a crossroads. The townsfolk looked upon him and realized they were witnessing more than a man. They were witnessing a truth carved into flesh and spirit. The poor farmer, once shamed for his poverty, now stood as a leader not by force, but by example. Yet in the eyes of the envious, his strength was a threat that could not be tolerated. And, as the sun sank into darkness, the West braced for the conflict that would decide not only his fate, but the legacy of everyone who dared to watch. The night after the confrontation, the town buzzed with unease. Some gathered in the saloon, their glasses full of whiskey, but their hearts heavy with doubt. They spoke in hushed tones, torn between admiration and resentment. For the first time, they were forced to question what truly defined a man's worth. Was it the size of his herd, the weight of his coins, or the courage to give when the world had nothing left to offer? Every man there knew the answer, but pride made the truth difficult to swallow. The farmer returned to his modest home in silence. He did not celebrate the moment he had calmed a square on the verge of chaos, nor did he lament the accusations that had been thrown at him. Instead, he sat by the fire, his calloused hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the flames. He thought not of himself, but of the tribe that had found life through his gift, and of the town that still struggled with its own hunger of spirit. In his heart, he carried no hatred, only the quiet hope that one day compassion would outweigh envy. Meanwhile, the tribe gathered under the stars, speaking of the bond that had been forged in their darkest hour. Elders told their children how a man who had been shamed became their deliverer, how his wagon full of food had been worth more than gold. They reminded the young that gratitude is a seed, and when planted, it grows into loyalty. The farmer's name became part of their stories, woven into their heritage as a symbol of generosity that transcended pride and poverty alike. Yet, not everyone was moved to reflection. A small group of ranchers, led by the one whose envy had burned the fiercest, began to plot in the shadows. To them, the farmer's rising influence was intolerable. They saw his dignity as a threat to their authority, his bond with the tribe as a danger to their dominance. The West was harsh, and in its dust and lawlessness, men often chose destruction when they could not claim control. Whispers of revenge crept through the night like snakes in tall grass. But while envy sharpened its blade, the farmer rose again at dawn and returned to his fields. He worked as if nothing had changed, his hands steady, his heart unshaken. For him, every furrow turned by the plow was a prayer, every seed pressed into the earth a promise. He had no time for schemes or pride. He lived by a truth the others had yet to understand, that the measure of a man was not what he owned, but what he gave back to the world. The weeks that followed brought a strange tension to the town. Respect and resentment battled openly in the eyes of its people. Some began to greet the farmer with cautious nods, their guilt softening into admiration. Others whispered in corners, their envy hardening into hatred. The West was a land that rarely allowed balance. Sooner or later, the weight of truth would tip the scales. The ranchers who conspired against him grew bolder. They spread rumors that the farmer's alliance with the tribe was dangerous, that he intended to bring strangers into their lands and strip them of their security. Fear is a powerful tool, and it found fertile soil in those already burdened by pride. Yet for every rumor, there were those who countered with truth. They had seen the farmer give without expectation. They had seen the tribe return not with threats, but with gifts of gratitude. Slowly, the town found itself divided between envy and faith. The farmer remained steady. He did not enter arguments, nor defend himself in taverns. He let his actions be his testimony. When a widow needed bread, his fields fed her table. When a child fell sick, he shared his herbs and remedies. He never asked for recognition, and that made his deeds echo even louder. In a land where men fought tooth and nail for glory, his refusal to seek it became his greatest strength. The tribe continued to honor him, sending their young to help with his harvest and their elders to sit at his fire. Their presence became a living shield, a reminder that alliances built on compassion were stronger than those forged by fear. This bond unsettled the envious ranchers even more, for they saw in it the beginning of a new order, one where dignity mattered more than wealth, and where the quiet farmer stood taller than their pride. And as another season turned, the fields heavy with promise, the town braced for the inevitable. It was clear to all that the story of the farmer would not end with whispers and glances. In the Old West, where the soil was stained with both blood and hope, every act of courage demanded a reckoning. And the reckoning was coming, carried on the wind like the warning of an unseen storm. The storm revealed itself one night beneath a moon pale as bone. The ranchers who had long festered in envy gathered outside the farmer's land, their shadows stretching long against the earth. They carried more than torches. They carried the weight of pride, anger, and fear. To them, this man's quiet strength was an insult they could not bear. The West had taught them that only the powerful should be honored, and they could not accept that dignity, born of hardship, had outshined their wealth. The farmer, roused by the restless barking of his dog, stepped outside to meet them. His frame was tired, his clothes simple, but his eyes did not flinch. He stood on his porch, hands empty, while the men hurled accusations. They called him a traitor, a deceiver, a danger to their way of life. The words were venom meant to break him, but he remained steady. In the silence between their shouts, he seemed larger than them all, not because of his strength, but because of his calm. Behind him, the tribe's warriors emerged from the shadows, their presence silent but resolute. They had anticipated the storm, for gratitude had bound them to the farmer, and they would not allow envy to consume him. The sight of their proud figures, armed and watchful, sent unease rippling through the ranchers' ranks. They had expected a man alone, not a man shielded by loyalty born of compassion. Still, pride drove them forward, blind to the warning in the night air. The townsfolk, awakened by the commotion, began to gather at a distance. They watched in silence, torn between fear of conflict and shame for what their neighbors had become. Whispers spread through the crowd, reminders of the farmer's kindness, stories of the food that had saved the tribe, murmurs of the widows and children he had helped. Slowly, the weight of truth pressed against the bitterness of envy, and hearts began to sway. The ranchers demanded that he leave the land, that he sever his bond with the tribe, that he return to the dust where they believed he belonged. But the farmer did not bend. His voice, quiet but unshaken, cut through the night. He reminded them that land does not define worth, and that giving does not betray, it redeems. His words were not sharp with anger, but heavy with truth, and though they struck softly, they struck deep. The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. For a moment, it seemed the ranchers might attack, their pride too wounded to retreat. Yet something in the farmer's stillness unsettled them more than any weapon. His courage exposed their weakness. His humility revealed their hollowness. And when the tribe's warriors stepped closer, their shadows falling like guardians at his side, the ranchers faltered. Pride could drive them far, but not far enough to face loyalty that strong. The townsfolk, emboldened by the farmer's words, began to step forward. One by one, men and women who had once mocked him now spoke aloud what had long weighed on their hearts. They confessed their shame, admitting they had been wrong to measure worth in gold and cattle. They spoke of his kindness, of the bread he had given, of the dignity he had carried in silence. Their voices rose, not in anger, but in solidarity, forming a wall stronger than any weapon. The ranchers, outnumbered not by force but by truth, found themselves exposed. Their accusations crumbled under the weight of the community's resolve. One by one, they retreated into the shadows, their pride carrying them away, their names forever marked by the shame of envy. The square that had once echoed with laughter at the farmer's expense now rang with respect for the man they had misunderstood. The tribe, witnessing the moment, lifted their hands in silent salute to the farmer. In their eyes, he was more than a neighbor, he was kin, and the townsfolk, humbled by his strength, finally understood the lesson he had lived from the beginning. That wealth is fleeting, but compassion endures. In that night of fire and whispers, dignity had triumphed over envy, and the town itself had been reborn. The farmer did not celebrate, nor did he demand recognition. He simply returned to his fields the next day, plow in hand, his heart steady as always. But something had shifted forever. Where once he had walked with shame trailing behind him, now he walked with honor beside him. And in the quiet language of the West, that was worth more than all the gold the ranchers could ever own. Seasons turned, and with them the memory of that night grew into legend. The town that had once ridiculed the farmer now carried his name with reverence, telling newcomers of the man who had given when all others withheld. Children grew up hearing the tale around campfires, their wide eyes filled with wonder at how a single act of compassion had silenced envy and reshaped an entire community. The farmer himself never sought to be remembered, but the story clung to him like the wind clings to the plains. The tribe, bound to him by gratitude and loyalty, visited often. They shared harvest feasts, hunted alongside him, and taught the town songs that had once been sung only in their own gatherings. What had begun as an act of kindness had grown into something larger, a bond that defied the divisions of culture and pride. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was respect. And in a land where alliances often crumbled under greed, this one endured because it was born from truth. The ranchers who had conspired against him lived in quiet disgrace. They worked their lands, but their names no longer carried weight. Their children listened to the story of the farmer with shame, knowing their fathers had stood on the wrong side of history. In the West, reputation was currency, and theirs had been spent in envy. The farmer, though he never sought revenge, had outlasted them not through power, but through patience. His silence had become their defeat. The farmer's own fields flourished, not with abundance alone, but with meaning. Neighbors came to help with the harvest, not out of pity, but out of respect. Families broke bread together at his table, and what had once been a symbol of poverty became the heart of the town's unity. Each season of planting and reaping was more than labor. It was a reminder that dignity, once rooted in the soil of a man's heart, could never be uprooted. And though the West was still a land of hardship, the town stood as proof that one man's compassion could ripple outward, reshaping lives beyond his own. The farmer's poverty had been his trial, but his giving had become his legacy. And with each new dawn, his story grew stronger, carried not by his voice, but by the lives forever touched by the man once shamed for having nothing, yet remembered for giving everything. Years later, when the farmer's hair had grown silver and his steps slowed with age, people still gathered to hear him speak. His words remained few, yet every syllable seemed carved from stone, shaped by years of endurance and grace. He never lectured, never boasted. He simply told stories of soil, of rain, of patience, and of gratitude. The same community that once mocked him now hung on every word, knowing that his life itself was the greatest lesson. The tribe honored him as a brother until the end of his days. When famine threatened again, they remembered his gift and answered it with loyalty, ensuring that his town never faced hunger alone. Their warriors stood alongside the townsfolk in times of danger, and their children played together in fields once divided by prejudice. The bond he had forged lived on, stronger than blood, a testament to the power of one act of selflessness in a land where selfishness was often the law. When he finally passed, it was not in solitude but surrounded by those who had once turned away. Tears fell freely, not out of pity but out of reverence. They laid him to rest on the hill, overlooking his fields, the soil rich with the fruits of his labor. The tribe and the town stood side by side, their voices rising in songs of mourning that echoed across the plains. It was the kind of farewell reserved not for the wealthy or the powerful, but for the truly great. His story lived long after the dust covered his grave. Travelers spoke his name in saloons, preachers wove his tale into sermons, and children recited his legacy as if it were scripture. He had begun as a figure of shame, a man mocked for poverty, yet he became the measure of worth in a land desperate for meaning. In a world that often remembered gunslingers and outlaws, his was a story of quiet heroism that endured even more powerfully. And so, the West carried forward his truth, that the strongest wealth is not gold, but compassion, that the greatest power is not pride, but humility, and that even in the harshest land, a man's worth is not decided by what he lacks, but by what he gives. The farmer, once scorned, had fed not only a starving tribe, but generations to come, leaving behind a legacy that no storm, no envy, and no time could erase. In the end, the farmer's story was never about fields or famine alone. It was about how one man's compassion reshaped an entire community. He showed that even in a land hardened by pride and survival, the quiet choice to give can silence mockery and turn shame into honor. The town, once blinded by arrogance, came to understand that true wealth is not counted in coins or cattle, but in the lives one touches through kindness. His silence, his labor, and his unshakable dignity became the foundation upon which respect was built. His journey revealed the fragile line between envy and admiration. At first, they mocked his poverty, unable to see past the dust on his boots. But when hunger threatened and he gave freely, they were forced to confront their own emptiness. The same hands they ridiculed became the very hands that sustained life. That transformation is a reminder to us all that greatness often hides where the world least expects it, waiting for the moment when action reveals truth. The tribe, the townsfolk, and the generations that followed carried forward more than just his story. They carried his lesson. That lesson was simple yet eternal. Never measure a man by what he lacks, but by what he gives. In a land where so many sought to take, he chose to share, and that choice became his legacy. Even the ranchers who once envied him could not erase the truth that compassion outlasts pride, and humility outshines arrogance. And so, his name was not carved in monuments of stone, but in the memory of every child who grew up hearing his tale. The West, a place that so often remembered guns and greed, kept alive the memory of a poor farmer whose generosity fed more than a starving tribe. It fed the spirit of a people. His life reminds us that when the dust of pride settles, what endures is the quiet strength of those who give without seeking recognition. If this story moved you, let's stay alive beyond this moment. Share your reflections in the comments. Tell us what this lesson means to you, and be part of a community that values stories of truth and dignity. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so together we can keep these powerful tales from the Old West alive, carrying their wisdom into every corner of our own lives.